Welcome to Agatha Christie She Watched, our spoiler-heavy look at the movie and TV adaptations of the mystery genre's greatest writer. I'm Bill Peschel of Peschel Press, publishers of the annotated novels of Agatha Christie, and today we're talking about snooping butlers, thieving in-laws, plumping noodles, and pumpkin cubes. It's the Murder of Kuroido, the 2018 Japanese adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. But first, let me introduce my partner in marriage, as well as crime of the fictional kind, Teresa Peschel. Teresa, how are you today?
Hi, I'm looking forward to discussing finally a good version of Roger Ackroyd, and when you watch this and then compare it to the David Suchet Roger Ackroyd, you will think, why on earth did they do what they did instead of making a good movie, a good adaptation, one that did not involve gunplay in the middle of a chemical factory?
One reason why we were interested in this movie is because we had recently published in the last year the complete annotated Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It was something I'd worked on for a long time, part of a series of 6 books by Agatha Christie, and we wanted to see how well they conformed to the story. And the book itself is full of information about the story itself and about Christie and about those times. We were looking forward to this.
No, this followed the text. Almost, I wouldn't say the dialogue moved over, but this followed virtually every single scene, every character. They only made one change to Dr. Sheppard to make him less of a villain and more of a sympathetic person. I was just amazed at what a wonderful adaptation this is. Absolutely wonderful.
This was the second of 3 shows that Fuji TV put out starring Mansai Nomura as Takeru Suguro, who is Hercule Poirot. He plays the character right down to the mustache. This is the second of 3. The third one we just saw last time, Promise of Death, based on Appointment with Death. We're still looking to find Murder on the Orient Express, which was the first one.
And folks, if you can give us a lead on how we can find Murder on the Orient Express with Mansai Nomura, we would be very grateful, because it's turning out to be very difficult to find. I have no idea why Fuji TV has not released any of this stuff on DVD. They have not made it available. You would think that they see a market with money. They are leaving money on the table, and they are not releasing these, and they are great.
Which was odd in a way, because at least on Amazon in Japan, there is a box set of Orient Express. They did some elaborate fan-made version in which it's an actual box showing the train, but it's not available. It's not available for sale, I don't think. And I don't think it's subtitled. Now, these are subtitled in English, and they went to the point of actually showing you, anytime they show you Japanese ideograms, they'll show you the translation for it. So somebody obviously went to the trouble of doing a really good job of translating these. So
yes, you do not have to speak Japanese in order to watch these movies if you've got the English subtitles, and they did a beautiful job.
And throughout this episode, like we did with Promise of Death, I'm afraid we're going to go ahead and use the English character names rather than mangling the Japanese language.
Because that's exactly what we would do.
As you can tell, because the Murder of Kuroido is, as you can see, it doesn't work very well, but it is Roger Ackroyd. It is the Kuroido? Kuroido?
I really don't know.
As you can see, this is why we're not going to do it. So it is the Ackroyd family. And what was fascinating about this is that they did changes to this, but they were all in the spirit of the book, and sometimes they made it a very clever version of, like, this one opens almost near the end. There's a scene near the end in which Dr. Sheppard gives Hercule Poirot the manuscript that he's been secretly writing of the case, and here they moved it to the front.
So you have a setup that you know things are going to end up with Poirot having the manuscript of Dr. Sheppard.
And it starts literally with the first lines from the book itself about Mrs. Ferrars dying on the 6th overnight between the 16th and 17th of June.
And then it's discovered, of course, that she committed suicide, but there is no suicide note. You see scenes with Dr. Sheppard and Roger Ackroyd and how he is visibly distraught. He had been planning on marrying Mrs. Ferrars because she was a widow and it had been long enough. The proprieties were being observed. One of the things about Roger Ackroyd is that he is very much aware of his position. He's very much aware of who he is, the deference due to him, and he wants what he wants. Sometimes they don't bring this out as much in the movie as it is in the novel, but it is there where he can't accept that other people may not want what he wants. And of course, that's the reason why he is so het up about Flora, his niece, marrying Ralph, his stepson, because it keeps all the money in the family and it keeps everybody in the family, whether they like it or not. That's what he wants them to do. And their feelings don't enter into this at all because he frankly does not care how they feel about the subject.
Another change they made to the story is to move it back to the post-war era. So we're talking the late 40s.
I think it's a bit later than that because Appointment with Death was set in about 1955, and I'm guessing this is 1955 as well.
It could be.
But it could, I don't know, because they have,
World War II.
It's definitely after World War II because one of the characters has been demobilized and he's wearing the clothes that the Japanese army gave him because they were the only clothes that he had. Cheap clothing that is readily identifiable to anybody as, oh, you haven't replaced that stuff yet?
And because he's a wandering tramp, then
and a methamphetamine addict, too, courtesy of the Japanese army.
It's very unusual because they make a point of saying he's still in his demobilized uniform, his clothes, and he's still wearing his Japanese infantryman's cap, which is a very distinctive style. It's in a rural location, and they are Dr. Sheppard bicycles everywhere. There's one scene in which he's bicycling Poirot home to his house, and it's this scene in which that Poirot decides that the timetable Dr. Sheppard gives for how long it took for him to get home after visiting Roger Ackroyd's house is too long.
What happened in that extra 10 minutes? It was interesting because, maybe this is before Appointment with Death. Thinking about it, I don't think we saw a single car on this entire show. The only vehicles that we saw were some horse-drawn carts in the fields in the background and a bicycle that Dr. Sheppard uses. I don't recall seeing any other vehicles. You know that there's somebody at the train station, but basically everybody is on foot with an occasional bicycle. The houses were odd because you see Dr. Sheppard bicycling past farmers working in the fields, and it is stoop labor. But the houses looked almost English, but not really. And then you get inside, and it's a mix of Japanese and English furnishings where you have these nice Western upholstered couches and tables and chairs. And then you also have more, I guess they would be Japanese fixtures where it's lower to the ground. And it was just a really interesting mix. And you wonder if these houses had been built prior to the war, and you don't get any background for that at all.
Yeah, it wouldn't be mentioned here, but there was a drive in Japan to westernize. I think this was any time after the opening of Japan, certainly after 1900 or so, where they were adopting Western clothing styles and it would apply to the building of houses and the furniture as well.
And if you were rich, of course, you would have the money to do this. And if you were a peasant, well, you would still be living in a mud hut with a grass roof and squatting on the floor because that's all you had. And
we did see this when Dr. Sheppard met with Ralph Payton at the inn, which was in the traditional Japanese style with the sliding rice paper doors, and he took his shoes off, which dovetails really nicely with the clue about the footprints.
Yes, because Dr. Sheppard was able to easily steal Ralph Payton's shoes.
Western shoes, which forced him to wear the traditional Japanese clogs after that.
The Gatas? Did they say Gatas?
Or Gatos, maybe.
No, it ended in an A. It was Gatas.
Gatas then, yeah.
It was Gatas. I thought that was just fascinating. I'm watching people's feet. I'm watching people's feet in the Gatas and thinking, wow, you have to learn how to walk in one of those. I would fall immediately.
But they were raised because, of course, if you're walking in the mud, you want to have your feet up high enough
so that your feet stay clean and dry.
Absolutely.
Almost everything that was in Agatha's novel translated over beautifully, absolutely beautifully. Caroline, Dr. Sheppard's sister, she is extremely well connected. Who told you that? The butcher's boy. Who told you that? The milkman. Who told told you that. Oh, it was Mrs. So-and-so's son-in-law who's visiting from Tokyo. Said, how do you know all of these people? Well, she knows everyone. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think the only scene that they didn't include was the mahjong scene in the novel where Dr. Sheppard is playing mahjong with Caroline and a couple of the other villagers, and they're discussing the case over mahjong, and that is the only scene that they removed. I don't know why they removed that scene, but they did. But you do get a funeral scene with both the viewing and the funeral service for Roger Ackroyd and Mrs. Ferrars, because they died very close together, only like 2 or 3 days apart. The Mrs. Ferrars committed suicide, and her suicide letter she mailed to Roger Ackroyd to explain why she did it and who was blackmailing her. Pretty much right out of the text. And Dr. Sheppard knew that if he wanted to maintain his position in the village and his position in life, well, he needed to do something, and he needed to do it in a hurry.
And so all the elements are there, the dictaphone being brought in, which Dr. Sheppard modified with a timer so that it would come on. We even see the scene in which Roger is reading from the letter as a way of demonstrating the machine's capabilities to Dr. Sheppard.
Oh, and it was a beautiful scene where they show why Dr. Sheppard moved the chair. In case you've ever wondered when you've read the novel, well, there was a low table in front of a window, and he put the dictaphone on that low table, and then he moved the chair, the Western-style chair, in front of the table so that it would conceal the dictaphone. And the explanation, the Poirot at the end, the explanation is excellent. But I had always wondered about that, and now I could see exactly what they were aiming at. It was a wonderful visual. Sometimes you really do, a picture really is worth 1,000 words, and a picture was worth 1,000 words. Of course, that's why he moved the chair. And it doesn't even have to be a big chair.
And I noticed when I was doing the annotations for The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, now available from Peschel Press, that they had editions in which the map showing the room incorrectly placed the positions of the chair. They weren't really that careful with their editorial process at times, depending on the publisher. So I had to make sure I was using the correct map of the room.
But I was just so impressed from start to finish. Carolyn Sheppard was Caroline. You know, she's interested in everything. She is running her brother's household. She knows everyone in the village. She wants to ferret out information, and you can see how she would become Miss Marple as she got older.
These people were younger than we expected.
They are all younger
than
in the novel.
And Carolyn was not nearly as obnoxious as in the book, or at least we're looking at her through Dr. Sheppard's eyes. She was far more pleasant in this episode than in the book.
And in fact, that's really the major change here, other than dropping the mahjong scene, is they made Dr. Sheppard more sympathetic at the end. Because the reason why he was blackmailing Mrs. Ferrars was not so that he could lose money on the stock market. It was so that he could pay for his dearest sister Caroline's brain surgery. That she's going to die within 6 months to a year if he can't get this particular American brain surgeon to come over and operate. That's why he blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. He knew Mrs. Ferrars poisoned her husband, and he saw the opportunity to siphon millions of yen out of her, and she committed suicide, and then he discovers that she probably sent the letter to her lover, Roger Ackroyd, and then he has to kill Roger Ackroyd, too.
Before he finds out who did it.
And so it just escalates. But by softening Dr. Sheppard's character, you lose an interesting point with Caroline, which is, in the novel, Dr. Sheppard actually says that he wonders sometimes what Caroline's real opinion of him is, if she suspects that he is bent in some way, and what she is doing as his older sister is protecting him from himself. And there's that subtle hint of Caroline knows more about him than he realizes, than he understands, and she recognizes that there is an evil strain within him. But here, Caroline doesn't see that. Caroline is not that kind of a person. And he, of course, oh my God, he blackmailed this woman and browbeat her because he had to have the money because his sister, whom he loves, was more important than her. And that's the other piece of strangeness. When you soften a character like Dr. Sheppard, is he's good friends with Roger Ackroyd. Roger Ackroyd is a wheel manufacturer. He's got serious money. Why didn't he ask Roger Ackroyd for help. And this is for a perfectly valid reason. My sister is ill. If we can afford to pay for an American surgeon to come over from the United States and do the surgery, or we can take Caroline to the United States for surgery, she'll live for many more years. Roger Ackroyd could pay for this. Why didn't Dr. Sheppard ask? And we never get that explanation. And if you're going to set this up that Dr. Sheppard is torturing Mrs. Ferrars for money, and she commits suicide, and then he murders Roger Ackroyd, his friend, somebody he has known for many years, to cover up his crime, well, he's really not that nice a guy, is he? And you're never given a reason for why he didn't ask for the money.
This plot point appears at the end of the episode, right near the end, and it just opens up this whole can of worms of questions, because we didn't know that Caroline has some kind of brain tumor. Apparently she was operated on and they found it. There was no indication that she was going to die soon. It was just kind of like brought in at the very end.
The only indication was, and this also happened in the last 15 minutes, is that Dr. Sheppard said, make sure you take your medicine, Caroline. That's the only hint that you get. And in fact, I thought that they were going to change something where Dr. Sheppard was going to cover up his crimes by murdering his sister, and I really thought we were going to go there. And I'll tell you, if this had been, say, a Marple episode, that's what they would have done.
I was expecting that too, as a matter of fact. I was kind of like, wow, that's out of nowhere. And yeah, we found the same thing happening in Death on the Nile, when they softened Gal Gadot's character by making her almost apologetic. I'm sorry, I stole and seduced your man and married him. I hope we can still be friends. And that's like, no, this is not how this works.
No, that's not how it works.
That is out of character. If she was going to be that kind and that self-aware of this, she wouldn't have done it.
She wouldn't have done it.
Or at least they would have acted more like they actually were passionately, massively in love with each other, instead of just kind of these Barbie and Ken dolls in their on the Nile branded costumes.
I was just so blown away with how well this all worked, and it proves that you can film a movie. You can film Roger Ackroyd correctly, because I really didn't know what to expect. Having watched the David Suchet version, that was terrible. That was probably one of the two worst novels that they filmed by a large margin. It, An Appointment with Death, with slave trading nuns, was the Roger Ackroyd was just absolutely terrible. They've completely twisted and changed everything around. It made zero sense, and it was stupid. Dr. Sheppard was still the villain at the end.
He was.
And you end
Caroline
up,
helping him
and
by
Caroline
bringing the gun
helping
to
him
the
by
meeting.
bringing him the gun. Then you have a shootout in the chemical factory. I really didn't know what to expect, but then I did know that Fuji TV made a fabulous Appointment with Death, so I had some hope that they would be true to the story, and they were very successful. And if you do not know the story, and you are watching this for the first time, you will be shocked at the ending, which is what Agatha wanted you to be. You will be absolutely shocked that the charming, pleasant, friendly, helpful Dr. Sheppard is a murderer and a blackmailer, and that every single thing that you have seen was a lie. You were not seeing it from the correct angle, so it can be done. And there is a Russian version of Roger Ackroyd. Apparently they follow the storyline, so with the Suchet Poirot, they didn't have to do that.
Watching this again becomes even more fun, because once you know how it ends, you can watch the doctor's reactions, because there was that moment early on when, who was it? Was it Flora Ackroyd's?
She's saying, oh, yes, I spoke to my uncle at 9:45, and you can see him thinking,
what the hell?
He was dead. I know he's
him.
Dead because I stabbed him myself.
At 9:30. What the hell is going on here? And what works as just an amazing reaction in general becomes even more meaningful once you know how the story ends.
Because, of course, what Dr. Sheppard doesn't understand, what Poirot does, is that plenty of people will lie during an investigation of any kind for reasons of their own that have nothing to do with the main crime. So Dr. Sheppard is assuming, as a normal person, that nobody is going to lie. So that's why he has his elaborate alibi, his elaborate timetables, and being in two places at once, and all of this other stuff. That's why he has everything set up the way he does, because he assumes that everyone else is going to tell the God's honest truth. Then Flora says, oh yes, I was there with my uncle. I was talking to my uncle at 9:45, and he knows damn well that the uncle had been dead for almost an hour because he'd stabbed him himself. And you're watching his reaction. What? Completely confused and not understanding what's going on.
There were other changes made as well. There were more subtle changes that were very much in keeping with the Japanese culture, particularly at that time, because when it came to hiding Ralph Payton...
It was at a shrine. It was not in a nursing home.
Yeah. So then there was a very funny moment near the end in which the doctor is talking with the priest, who's complaining about a rash down there. And they wonder where he got that from.
Yes, apparently he picked up VD somewhere, but he can't tell his wife. And Dr. Sheppard blackmails the temple priest. I won't tell your wife if you let Ralph Payton hide. You know when you're watching this, you're not in England. And that's one of the interesting comparisons between this and the anime series, Agatha Christie's Great Detectives, Poirot and Marple. The Japanese influence is much more subtle in that everybody looks reasonably English, and, the clothes and the settings and the cars and the whole 9 yards. And then occasionally you see a little hint of it, that the fact that it's not an English production. Whereas here, there are changes made to make it fit with Japanese culture, and Agatha translates beautifully. Of course, you're going to have family members who have power, who are able to tell other family members what they can and can't do. And of course, a properly brought up upper-class lady like Flora's mother, Mrs. Ackroyd. She is the sister-in-law of Roger Ackroyd. She's a widow, and she's deeply offended that she only gets a little more money in the will than the housekeeper does. She's on par with the servants. Of course she's going to be deeply offended by this.
There are some things which are universal, and one of them being the control of your own money is a good thing.
Absolutely. But so much of the text made it over. The housekeeper and her ne'er-do-well drug-addicted son. She loves her son, her only son. She's trying to take care of him, and she can't. He is abusive to her, and he is a drug addict. Agatha's prose from 1926 translated over into very early 50s after the war in Japan. The butler, he looks to be an extortionist. He is always trying to find out secrets, and he's not very good at it, but that's why his previous employer let him go, and here we are. It's just almost letter for letter.
Oh, and let's not forget Hector Blunt. Instead of the African big game hunter,
he became a writer, and maybe this means something in Japan, I don't know. Virtually everyone we saw wore Western clothes, except Hector Blunt, important writer. He was always traditionally dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And for the major characters, I mean, generally when you saw somebody who was traditionally dressed, they were either a peasant in the fields or they were one of the Shinto priests. He always wore the kimono and gaita, and you're thinking, why is he dressed differently? And I'm sure it means something to a Japanese audience.
It reminded me of the Japanese author Yukio Mishima, who, after the war, advocated a return to traditional Japanese values. And he favored, even though he wore Western costumes, I think he also almost wanted to go back to the Edo period, if I'm remembering correct, because after the war, he died in 1970. So we're talking like somebody from the 60s and 70s. And he tried to inspire a revolt among a Japanese army unit. He and his followers went there, and he had the traditional bandana at the top and wearing his own uniform. And they laughed at him because it was like, we're not going to go back to that.
We're not doing that again, you idiot.
Do that. And he ended up committing seppuku and being beheaded by his follower, which is incredibly gruesome, but there you go.
Well, one thing you can say about after you've disemboweled yourself, if you have somebody cut your head off, it ends the pain rather quickly.
Yeah, hoping that they do it correctly. Because let's face it, it's, unlike the movies, trying to cut somebody's head off, even with a very sharp Japanese sword, is problematic.
I think you have to have some muscle. You've got to have some muscle to push that blade through the neck, because it's not like you're going to be able to line it up perfectly in the little gaps between the neck bones. Good luck with that.
So yes, he had writer's block, he was staying there, and he was wearing traditional Japanese costume.
Yeah, he was wearing a traditional kimono, and I am sure that colors and the styles and everything meant something to a Japanese audience, but to us, a Western audience, what it did is made him stand out even more. And we're looking at this and thinking, why are you doing this? The other thing that changed a little bit, And I thought this was interesting, is that Dr. Sheppard, and again, a lot of the cast was youthened over what is in the novel, but Dr. Sheppard apparently would not be unhappy about marrying Flora Ackroyd, because then he would become Roger Ackroyd's son-in-law and rich. And you see this where he's kind of like flirting with Flora. He's jealous of the fact that Flora is flirting with Hector Blunt, the writer. Dr. Sheppard can accept Flora marrying Ralph Peyton because this is something that Roger Ackroyd has arranged, but Ralph Peyton himself implies to Dr. Sheppard that this is not something that Roger Ackroyd would accept. But Dr. Sheppard misunderstands because, of course, he doesn't know that Ralph Peyton secretly married Ursula the parlor maid. He does not know this, and so he is assuming that the engagement is between Ralph and Flora and that they want it and Roger Ackroyd doesn't. And of course, if Roger Ackroyd doesn't want them to marry, then he could marry Flora and he could become part of the Ackroyd family and he could be rich and help his sister pay for the brain surgery. So he's going to be pissy and jealous with Hector Blunt, and then he discovers that it was never Flora and Ralph Peyton's idea that they get married. That was Roger Ackroyd's, and he's starting to realize that he doesn't know what's going on either, that there are things going on that he doesn't have control over everything.
Right, a very subtle touch there, but I think you're right.
Yeah, and it was really kind of amusing to watch Dr. Sheppard ready to save Flora from fainting, to put his manly arms around Flora, and she pulls away from him and has only eyes for Hector Blunt, writer.
That's right. She falls into his arms twice.
Yes,
just
exactly.
in case he missed it the first time. Again, another modification. I think that's one reason why I really kind of annoyed me in the end when the brain surgery theme came up, because everything else was so good and this stood out.
It did stand out because it just didn't feel quite right, because it suddenly made Dr. Sheppard a more sympathetic character, and yet you cannot get past the fact that Dr. Sheppard hounded Mrs. Ferrars to her death for money, and yet he couldn't ask Roger Ackroyd, and you are never given a reason why he didn't ask the richest man in the village, someone known far and wide, and someone he has known for many, many years. Why didn't he ask Roger Ackroyd for the money? And you are not given an answer.
He's willing to kill two people and get Ralph Peyton arrested for murder, then ask for money.
It's okay. Blackmail is okay, but asking for a loan is not.
That's right. Go figure. There's just two more points to bring up because I mentioned them. In the introduction was one of them was the plumping noodles, which is apparently some kind of Japanese dish that Dr. Sheppard had to get home in time because
the noodles would bloat. And I guess the idea is that you want the noodles to still have, doing a lot of cooking, you want the noodles to have, whatever noodles you're making, you want the noodles to have a certain texture where they have a little bit of a firmness in the center of them. They still have a bite. You don't want them to be soft and mushy. And if you leave noodles, any kind of noodle, in the boiling water for too long, they become mushy. They disintegrate. They fall apart and you lose the texture, you lose the appearance. It just does not work. I don't care what kind of noodles you're talking about. German noodles do the same thing. Italian noodles, Japanese noodles. Noodles have to be watched because they will turn on you in seconds. They have a very limited window when they're perfect, and then you overcook them, and then the noodles are mushy.
Which leads to a comedy scene in which the doctor is bicycling home with Poirot on the back of his bicycle and complaining all the way, and then only to later see that he was also secretly looking at his watch to check the time from Roger Ackroyd's house to Dr. Sheppard's clinic/home.
Yes, how long does this actually take? And there's also a little point there that if the doctor can make it from Roger Ackroyd's house to his own house in a limited amount of time while carrying the weight of Poirot, and it still only takes him 2 minutes more, what on earth was he doing with all of that time?
Yep, which is, again, a plot point in the book, and it's an indication that something is off.
That somebody is lying.
And then there's the final point I had to make about the pumpkin cubes, because, again, when you think about it, Agatha should have had Poirot do this in the first place. Why because he originally retired to the country. It's canon. He retired to the country in Roger Ackroyd because he wanted to grow marrows.
Vegetable marrows. Those are zucchinis, folk. For an American audience, those are zucchinis.
That had flavor, which is like, okay, but Poirot, I guess he's kind of a gourmand in a way. I mean, being Belgian, he likes his food. But I liked it so much better that he retired to the country to grow
square pumpkins. And yes, it is possible to grow pumpkins or any other kind of a squash or pears or other things like this. You grow them inside of a container so they take on the shape of the container. And there are even little mustache cutouts on the little wooden boxes that Poirot is growing so that when the pumpkins fill the box, he takes off the box and then you have perfect little square pumpkins with little mustaches on them. And it is so cute. And I have seen this in gardening catalogs. You can grow shaped pumpkins or shaped squash. It is a clear plastic, like the outline of a face. You put the baby vegetable inside it and it fills it up and fills it up and fills it up. And then when the plastic mold is completely filled, then you remove it and you have a cantaloupe or a cucumber, and it is the shape you want. If you've ever seen pear liqueur and there is an entire pear inside of the bottle and you think, how did they do that? Is you take the branch of the pear with the baby pear when it has just formed, just after the flower has been fertilized, you slide the entire branch, leaves and all, into the jar, tie the jar to the branch, and then the pear grows inside of the bottle. And then when you're ready to harvest the pear, you snip all of the excess off, remove as much of the branch as you can, and that's how you have the pear inside the glass bottle. Absolutely Japanese.
But very appropriate for Poirot because he loves symmetry and order. He loves symmetry and order, and showing us 16 of those pumpkins with, a correct amount, 4x4. A
4x4 grid. The only thing I would say, in fact, of all of the scenes with Poirot that did not work, in the background, in some of the scenes in Poirot's house, books are stacked willy-nilly. They are stacked willy-nilly instead of being arranged perfectly on shelves. And every time I saw that, I thought, Poirot would never do that. And that's the only thing I saw in this entire movie that I would say Poirot would never do that. Those books, if they had to be stacked because he didn't have enough bookshelves, they would be lined up by size in perfectly symmetrical little ziggurats. Not quite to a badly arranged used bookstore, but heading in that direction.
It would have been bad enough for Poirot. He is very precise. If it takes 2 perfectly symmetrical eggs for him to have his breakfast, he's not going to put up with.
Yeah, he's not going to put up with misaligned books, but I could absolutely see Poirot growing vegetables in square molds in order to make them perfectly square. And yes, you can buy square cantaloupes and square watermelons in the Japanese market, and that's how they're grown. I don't know what it does for the taste, but they sure look cute.
We very much enjoyed The Murder of Kuroido, and we certainly recommend if you get an opportunity to see it. We found our copy on Dailymotion, the website, and might still be there, I don't know, but I hope you get a chance to take a look at any of these episodes starring Mansai Nomura.
Yes, they did a wonderful, wonderful job. And again, if you know how we can get a copy of his Murder on the Orient Express, we would very much like to know so that we can watch it ourselves. Just a reminder, folks, that we do have a website, Peschel Press, and if you want to read any of my reviews of Agatha Christie films, they're all there. And when we are finished with the Agatha Christie project, it will become a book of reviews. Our website also lists our events. So if you want to happen to be in the central Pennsylvania area and you want to come out and talk to us in person, we are happy to do that.
This is the end of another episode of Agatha Christie She Watched. I'm Bill Peschel.
And I'm Teresa Peschel.
And we'll see you at the movies. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Agatha Christie She Watched is Teresa Peschel and Bill Peschel. Produced by Bill Peschel. Theme song, Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod. New episodes come out every week wherever you stream your content. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can help support us by going to anchor.fm/mystery and leaving a 5-star rating and review, and by helping to spread the word. To advertise on Mystery She Watched, email Peschel at peschelpress.com. All questions and comments can be emailed to Peschel at peschelpress.com. And thank you for listening.